channels all converging at the same space, which means that you almost completely eliminate any kind of longitudinal chromatic aberration. That shows up as typically as a purple fringing before the plane of focus and then a green fringing after the plane of focus. Now, when you're looking at macro levels, any kind of aberration is going to occupy more pixels because everything is magnified. And so particularly with some topics, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but if you're shooting coins, for example, and I've got for a long time, ever since I've been a kid, I've had a coin collection of currency from around the world. I don't know that any of it is particularly valuable, but it's just interesting to me, and it's become a great subject for doing macro, that whenever I test macro lenses, I pull out some of these coins just because they're unique and there's some amazing details that show up. But if you're doing macro with some kind of shiny metallic object, or a camera is another thing that I'll talk about, those chromatic aberrations tend to really show up. And so that's why apochromatic is important. So if you're on a budget, either this lens, the 65mm f2.8, also there is basically the full frame version of this lens, which is 100mm f2.8, also a 2x, also apochromatic from Laowa. That's a little bit more expensive, but very inexpensive compared to a lot of the competing options. And so, by the way, I own 4 macro lenses. 2 of the ones that I own are apochromatic designs because it is a big deal, particularly for some kinds of photography. Now, if your budget doesn't run that far, you can't even afford a new lens. A way that it's not as good, but it can be also satisfactory for doing a lot of these projects, is to experiment with what is called extension tubes. Now, extension tubes, essentially what they're doing is that they are moving the lens further away from the sensor. So it's basically just a spacer that goes in there, but it's designed to where everything still bayonets onto your camera. But as you increase the distance of the lens from the sensor, it allows the lens to focus down closer and closer, though at the expense of infinity focus. So what you're gaining on the macro lens level, you're losing on the infinity level. And so it's obviously not as versatile for that reason as a pure macro lens. However, you can get some really interesting shots using extension tubes, something that I've done in the past experimenting with as well. And so, there's a little bit of the gear talk aside for you. So let's talk about a few of these different types of photography. We might as well start with the money, since I've already discussed that. So one of the things about if you're using money around, one of the reasons that money is interesting is that number one, particularly if you're using a local currency, it is something that is familiar to your audience. And so they have all seen the coin. They've probably almost never seen it up close. And so most people have no idea that at a macro level, you can actually see little spurs in the metal, and you can see some of these details that pop up that people are unaware that are there. And in some cases, not just with coins, but I also find with bills, it's remarkable the detail that's there in these familiar objects. And so part of the reason why I find, doing coins as being interesting is the fact of that familiarity, and yet it's an unfamiliar perspective on it. Perspective is important when you're doing macro. Often one of the least engaging perspectives is the perspective of myself. I'm 6'1". Looking down at something is rarely an interesting perspective for any kind of photography, but particularly for macro photography. You tend to get, something very, very flat. And if your goal is to get everything in focus, the whole, face of the coin in focus, great. But often, the advantage of macro, that even if you're in a tight space, your apartment or your house, and you may not even have a great background, macro, when you're focusing down that close at macro levels, the background's beyond very quickly. Depth of field is really tiny, so everything beyond there tends to completely disappear anyway. And so creating bokeh, blurred out areas, and allowing, for example, in this shot, having the thin edge of the coin showing, with everything else fading away to defocus, is a really, really engaging approach. And so try experimenting with something you have on hand. Hopefully, isolation has not been going on so long that you have no money in the house. But if you do have some money, have some fun with it. Take some pictures of it. It's a great macro subject. And so that is worth taking a look. Now, let me just pause there and talk to you about what you can do about background. So one of the interesting things that is that bubble wrap like this, you'll see as I'm holding it up and I've got light on myself, you'll see that there are different kind of, bright points on the bubble wrap. So what you can do that's really interesting is to set this up behind a macro subject. But what I've done is I've set this up, and so it has light that reflects. It allows like bokeh highlights, circles to emerge behind there. It also can cover up a busier background. And so it's basically a free thing. You might have some on hand already, or dig around in your garbage out of a package and pull some out. But it can make for a really intriguing background and cost you literally nothing. Another thing that is interesting to have access to is a reflector. And a lot of reflectors, for example, this one has multiple options in it. And so it's a reflector that you can flip this around and you can get a gold side, you can get a silver side, you can use it on the white, or in this case as the black. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can have a lot of different options for your setup just by using this. And so you get a completely different photo by placing an object and shooting macro on a silvery surface than what you do on a gold surface, than what you do on a black or a white surface. And so reflectors like this tend to not be incredibly expensive. And so it is an option to just give you some versatility. And of course, it becomes handy for a lot of other type photography. What I'll often do for product photography is that, for example, you could I take a lot of photos of lenses, for my lens reviews. So a lot of times what I'm doing is just setting the lens on a camera, on a tripod, and actually just a few feet away having a solid black background of just one of these leaned up against a wall that creates a clean background, particularly if you use light correctly. So let's transition on and talk about light for a minute. So light is obviously, at the heart of photography in general. And so, as this series started off with Christopher Frost talking about macro photography, and he talked about some lights as a part of that, macro ring type lights that mount around the lens. You can use, speed lights, you can use fixed lights like this. But in some cases, what you want is a gentle source of light. In some cases, high contrast is a bad thing. And so you don't want too much light, too many reflective surfaces. And so having a soft source of light is good. Having a ring lights can tend to be a fairly even, nice light. And so that's an option. In some cases, however, you want the exact opposite. So a soft light gives you even illumination. And so that can be really, really useful. But in some cases, you want harsh illumination because you want to be able to have a very bright amount of light on one subject, which is going to lead me to another project here, and by eliminating the background. And so the project that I'm going to show, I'll show you a few photos from this, but I wanted to play with smoke, with mist, okay, as a part of this. And so I was just using, looking, and I actually used this lens for these shots. But my wife had this essential oil diffuser going in our home. And so an object that a lot of people have in their homes at this point. And so the mist is coming up, and so I'm getting that effect. However, where it's sitting, I just shot these photos right here in my living room that's behind me, in the place where I never even moved this. It was in the place where my wife was using it. But what I did is I set up the camera on a tripod. I focused in the area that I wanted in advance, and so I didn't have to worry about that. And so in this case, what I wanted was a very bright light source of light just in the mist itself. And so the water droplets, the steam, the vapor would be illuminated, but the background would disappear because it was lit so much less. And that's the amazing thing about light, is that if you highlight light on a subject, the ambient light in the room tends to disappear. And so I shot this in the middle of the day. There was plenty of light in the room. But by putting a very intense flashlight through the steam coming up and then, adjusting my exposure so it was just for that light, I was able to create some of these images that I think are really, really interesting, particularly if you jump in and you look at them at a detailed level. And so that allows you to really get some incredibly unique type looks. I've done something similar for these shots here where I was actually shooting, I was shooting commercial photography for a maker of bike lights. And so I had mounted the light on the handlebar of my bicycle. And so what I did is I put a fairly intense amount of light. And so we were trying to illustrate not only that, that the light is bright, but in this case, I was trying to illustrate the fact that it was waterproof. And so, you could be writing in weather and it still worked. And so what I did in that case is I had light going through the midst. I was focused on what I wanted to do with my macro lens. But then all I did to create the rain effect that you see in this is just right over the top of the shot, I had a little spray bottle, and I was just continually shooting just a spray falling over it. And so again, very simple to do in your own home, but by the use of light and then water in this case, I was able to create some really, really compelling looking end results. And so, some things to experiment with in your own home. Easy to do. You don't have to purchase expensive accessories. You just need to understand a little bit about how light works. Now, if you are into cameras at all, camera lenses, camera gear, I think that this makes for really interesting photography subjects. And so that's one thing that I have always enjoyed doing is doing photography, particularly of some of these vintage cameras. And I'll have to confess that bellows types cameras are my favorite for this. For one thing, the very fact that the bellows kind of extends out gives you a really kind of visually interesting, because you've got this, and like for example in this shot, I always felt like it kind of looked like a train bearing down on me, and it was really, really cool. But also in some of these old cameras, the amount of detail in the metalwork is really, really quite exquisite, particularly if you look at it at a macro type level. And so it just gives you a lot of options of playing around. I mean, a lot of times you can find vintage cameras like this at pawn shops or secondhand stores, yard sales, and pay next to nothing for them because, for many people, they don't really have any value any longer, but they do make for really, really compelling photography subjects, macro subjects, and also lenses, catching the fine details of them, and playing with the way that you have light bounce off the coatings on the front element. All of those things can be really, really intriguing. Another project that probably a lot of you have even maybe thought about before, it can be a little bit technically challenging to pull it off sometime, but it is about the water droplet or milk droplet. And so, of course, when water or oil or milk strikes another subject, it creates a lot of very interesting shapes. You have to catch them at the right moment, obviously. And so to set up a shot like this, here's a few kind of tips. And so let me show you a couple of my end results here, and then I'll give you a little bit of explanation about how I executed them. So with milk, what I like to do is to use this is actually just a pet dish here for feeding pets. And so for one thing, you don't want to, for me, I don't want to waste a whole massive amount of milk. And so I want to contain it in a fairly small area. So I'll put a certain amount of milk into this dish. The fact that it is bright also means that there is some extra help in internal lighting because there's going to be reflections coming off of it. So obviously in this case, you're going to want to pre-focus, which again, if you're not using a manual focus macro lens, which in many cases, manual is really good for macro purposes. Your depth of field is so tiny at those focus distances, it can sometimes be hard to put a focus point where you want it. So even if you're using an autofocus lens, particularly for this project, you're going to want to switch into manual focus and to pre-focus in the area where you want to be in focus. It will probably help to stop down your aperture to f5.6, f8, even f11. And so that will allow a little bit more to be in focus because it's hard to precisely control where the water droplets or the milk is going to fall on every occasion. And so good to get that up. You want a source of light, and you probably want the source of light coming from a similar direction where your camera is shooting, and so that it is, like for example, as a water droplet comes up, if the source of the light is behind, what you'll actually get is lighting on the back side of where you're actually shooting. And so you don't want that to be the case. And so it's good to have a light source that's going to front illuminate, and so you're going to capture better detail that way. I like using a little eyedropper like this. for the simple reason that it gives you a little bit more precision over dropping the droplets of whatever you're dropping, oil, water, milk, whatever. And so that can be beneficial because it'll allow you to regulate kind of the quantity. You want to just release drops, not a steady stream. And then also you want to be able to, try to drop it with precision. It can actually be helpful in this case to have someone else participating in the project. If not, if it's just you, probably the best thing to do is to set up your camera to where it's just going to continue to take a bunch of pictures. Typically you can set that up in advance, almost like a, not quite like a time lapse. You can set it up to take, a burst of photos. And that's a good way to do it. Either that or you're gonna have to kind of keep your finger on the shutter button, holding it down while it shoots all of the shots. But in this case, it's gonna be more about quantity rather than trying to time it. It's such a split second at that impact. It's better to shoot as fast as your camera can on a burst mode and then go through it and choose the perfect moments that you've gotten. And so this project can be really interesting. Now let me take a look at this shot. It's a beautiful water crown. And what I actually did in this is maybe the most simple of all. I was shooting, what I used is a stainless steel sink, and which in many cases there's a window behind the sink, and so it's getting some natural light. And so I actually just used available light for this. And what I did is I set the faucet onto a very slow drip. And so then what I did is that I just shot the impact. As those drips fell, I would do a burst, and I got some beautiful crowns by doing that. And so, there is another project that you can use with basically no additional accessories, but, just a little bit of patience and choosing the best shots. But you can get some really amazing looking photos by taking that approach. So one final project that I want to talk to you about is involving jewelry. And so again, taking a different look at something and getting onto a macro level allows you to do some unique things with jewelry. And so a lot of times, wedding photographers will set up some really cool shots using shoes, rings, flowers, different things in conjunction with each other. And so obviously that can be, you can get some really cool shots doing that in a wedding situation, but you don't have to be a wedding photographer to get some really, really amazing photos of, some beloved family jewelry. And so in that case, a lot of the techniques that I've already talked about are going to bear true there. But basically think about staging it, and here's a few shots, different ideas that I've used. You can utilize books. That's a very popular shot, putting it in the pages of a book, against shoes or other things. You can really create some beautiful macro images by utilizing jewelry as a part of that. So just be creative in your approach to that. Another popular thing can be the use of food. As of that, if you've got flowers in your home, I've been accused in the past of buying flowers for my wife just so it gives me a photography subject at the moment. And so I don't think I'm actually guilty of that, but I will confess that whenever I have flowers around, I do take advantage of that, particularly in winter when there's not a lot going on outside. And so, literally you are surrounded by all kinds of cool macro projects right now. I've taken some really cool photos and really cool video of, for example, a light bulb turning on. And, and unfortunately the old incandescent bulbs are the best for that. I've taken some cool shots turning on the gas on a stovetop, for example, and getting in close to those jets. And that's really cool for video because it's, just illuminates something that's very, very, again, you don't see close up under usual circumstances. And so literally all around you are some great, great subjects for shooting macro photography. So if you're stuck at home right now and your creativity is desperate for an outlet, macro photography can be the best way to indulge that moment, indulge that creativity, and you can get some shots you can be really proud of. Outside of all of the great opportunities to go outside and to shoot flowers and to shoot insects and any number of other outside subjects, there are some great, great subjects inside as well. I'm Dustin Abbott, and I hope that this has help to give you some ideas to get your mind going of options that you can use in this moment to create some really, really cool images. So I wish you the very best in your pursuit. Unleash that creativity, and be sure to, if you haven't already, to check out the page I'll throw up here where you can see the live view if you missed the live view, and you can see what happened as a part of that discussion there. Look also in the description down below, and you can find ways to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. All right, everyone, we are back with on live on camera, and so I'll transition to answering some of your questions here and doing my best to respond to some of the questions that have come in while we were streaming here. So let me just kind of go back through and take a look at some of the things. So Sam talking about, great to see me doing this collaboration with Laowa. I agree. It's they've been a great partner in this, and I think it's a great idea considering that we're all kind of in the same boat at the moment when it comes to dealing with isolation, and so I think it is a great idea as well. So, and he's complimenting me on my reviews, and so I appreciate that as well. And so then some complaints about the doubling up on audio, and that was my bad. I apologize for that. That was happening during the time that we were playing back the video, and there was some doubling up because I had open in another window, it actually playing here. So thanks to all of you that pointed that out. We got it fixed. Jerry talking about great bokeh, and I'm not exactly sure at what point that was, but Jerry, thanks. And Yanni wants to eat my donuts. That's going to be a little bit hard since I'm in Canada and she's in Hong Kong, but my wife Lana made those donuts, and yes, they were delicious. What brand of, Joanne is asking what brand of torch I used for demonstrating in that photo. Well, ironically, I actually used a torch that was designed by a company that I did product photography for another time. And so you saw a few things with the brand Night Pro Vision. And so this is their TX11. It is an incredibly bright, intense torch. And so yeah, it's pretty fantastic. I'm going to give you a little boost of extra AF there, so maybe you can get a peek at it. So yeah, it is extremely bright, and so lots of levels of brightness. So yeah, there you're blinded for the day. Okay, so let's take a look. Lucifa asked the question about how do you count when to release the shutter. That is a very good question and certainly a very big challenge, and you asked that question during the water or milk drop or some kind of liquid drop section. And so yeah, that is a really challenging thing to do, and so that's why I recommend doing it on a burst type mode. And so the easiest thing to do is to have another person doing the dropping, and so you can focus on shutter. The other way to handle that is a remote release cable, which can often be purchased for quite inexpensively. Can be handy, and just have your camera on burst mode, and you can try to just burst through the whole time that you are doing the drops, because the thing is that the shapes really differ every little split second. And so this is more about, I'm typically very deliberate in my photography. I don't like to burst on a lot of things. However, with doing the water droplets, doing a burst is the way to get the best end result, for the simple reason that because things change, so you cannot time it well enough in your mind to get the perfect moment. You need to burst and then kind of go through your images and see which one is best on that. Jerry said he saw a cat with a dairy cow color walking by. That was actually our dog, and she's highly offended. She thinks you think that she looks like a cat. Yanni says, so romantic, my boyfriend never sends me flowers. Oh, Yanni, you just threw your boyfriend under the bus. And, well, maybe he should become a macro photographer, and then he would have an ulterior motive to buy you flowers, just like me. Jerry says, really nice photos. Thank you, Jerry.
Jimmy, oh, Jimmy says to Yeti, first you need to send him a Laowa lens. Yeah, I'm on board with that. Erwin says, hi from Chicago. Ideal lens or aperture? You kind of need to be a little bit more specific, Erwin, as to what type of photography you're talking about. So maybe you can send me a follow-up question and I can try to give you a better answer. I do have some favorite lenses all around, and so, but my favorite lens tends to depend on what kind of photography I'm doing. For example, I mean, I love my Canon 35mm f1.4 L Mark II. I don't like it very well when I'm trying to shoot wildlife, however, and so you really have to pick the right tool for the job. So going on, so Erwin, please follow up with that, and I'll do my best to give you a more intelligent answer than that. Lucifa asks again, how to light the liquid better to reduce reflection but at the same time have high contrast. There's kind of two different things that you're asking there, and so to reduce reflection you typically want to have a soft lighting source, and so a softer lighting source helps to eliminate some reflection because you're not in the moment, you're not focused on just kind of one area. The other thing though is that if you want high contrast, probably your best bet is to go for getting high contrast is really more about how you've actually set up your settings in your camera. And so typically what you're going to want to do if you want to increase your contrast is to get the lighting that you want on your subject and then try to bring down ambient light. And so kind of the best way to do that is to move your light closer to your subject, and then if you have lower ambient light, what that allows you to do is to have a high amount of contrast. Now, you may want to also do some of that in your post-processing, depending on the circumstance and how confident you are in doing that, because sometimes you can actually get a better end result by doing a little bit of work after the fact, and so you can watch that. Kevin is porting over from YouTube a question asking, are you using an LED screen for easy and precise manual focusing? Yeah, it's a good question. When it comes to using manual focus lenses, here's my cheat sheet these days, and that is that I'm actually almost exclusively using mirrorless cameras at this point. And part of the reason that I liked the switch to mirrorless is the fact that they are so much better for manual focus. And I do have a number of manual focus lenses in my kit. I mentioned in that video, by the way, that I own 4 macro lenses. Well, 3 of those 4 are manual focus, and so if that gives you an idea. And so there are a lot of focus aids on mirrorless. However, when my primary body that I use for DSLR for shooting mirrorless, I actually kept a Canon 6D body with an EGS focus screen in it. And then you can use that with EGS for autofocus lenses as well, but I tended to kind of do a lot of my, actually for a while I had 2 6D bodies, and so I had one of them set up with an EGS focus screen, and that is a matte precision focus screen that actually shows you true depth of field. It's not an expensive changeover. The EGS screen only cost around $35. The problem is, of course that depends on what market you're in, but the problem with swapping out is that not all cameras allow you to do that. And so, your mileage may vary on that. And so anyway, but yeah, the other thing you can do that is actually, particularly for macro photography, a nice option, it's obviously it's more money, but using like a monitor is really, really nice. There's a lot of, these days, relatively inexpensive monitors you can either mount on the camera or elsewhere, and they can be really good for having a bigger screen area to see manual focus. So anyway, so there is hopefully some feedback on that. Okay, Kevin asked, do you find the 2-to-1 magnification from the Laowa useful? The answer is yes. However, it really depends on what I'm doing. And so there are some situations where I don't even need 1-to-1 magnification from a macro lens. But of course, like everything, I think that having the option is better. And so there are certainly situations where having that extra bit of magnification is tremendously useful, and particularly when you've got a lens like either the 65mm or the 100mm Laowa lenses that allow you to really get very, very sharp, high contrast results. So, on that note, let me throw up again really quick. Here is the discount code that is available for the next week, and the first 20 customers to check out with it will get 5% off. And so anyway, just want to throw that up again. The code is 253MDA. Okay, back to the questions. Richard says, love your work, Dustin. Hi from New Zealand. Thanks, Richard. I appreciate it. And one thing that I really love about doing what I do is that there are fantastic people all around the world that I get to engage with. The other morning I did a premiere of one of my videos and just watched with the people that were tuning in. And so the people that were engaging with me, there was someone from Australia, somebody from the UK, someone from Ireland, someone from Germany, someone from the USA. On and on the list goes. And how amazing is that? We're so fortunate, so blessed to live in a world where we can actually engage with one another from all around the world. And so New Zealand is awesome. It's on my bucket list of places that I would love to do photography in. So another question is, does using multiple extension tubes reduce image quality? That's a good question. So first of all, understand that extension tubes are just air. There are no optics there, and so in a sense, you can't really degrade image quality in some metrics because there's no new elements being introduced. So all you're basically doing is moving the existing optics further away from the sensor, which allows you to focus down closer. Now, in some situations, you can end up with exaggerating other flaws that are there. That could be distortion. Sometimes you might be able to introduce more of a mechanical vignette, but typically when you're moving the front of the lens further away from the sensor, that's not really a problem. So I would say my general answer is no, that's not the problem. What you will find is that the further you get away, you start to work with really small focus distances, working distances, and so you really have to move the whole assembly around a fair bit, including the camera and lens, because unlike a true macro lens that you have a full focus range to work with, multiple extension tubes or even a thick extension tube means that you're working with just little tiny bits of depth of field, no matter how you focus the lens itself. And so that's really the primary limitation more than optical issues there. Kevin asked, Dustin, I want to know what made you start reviewing lenses on YouTube. That's kind of a funny story, Kevin, because I started off doing just reviews on my website, text reviews. And I actually was kind of dismissive of YouTube. I didn't personally spend a lot of time on YouTube. I didn't really think of myself as an on-camera guy. And so actually the first couple of videos that I posted were really just to augment my text reviews. For example, there was a few things that I couldn't really demonstrate in text, like focus speed. So my very first video, I believe, was actually comparing a Tamron and a Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter lenses, just their focus speed. And that's all the video was. And so then at some point it kind of hit me that since I did have a YouTube channel, and I didn't have a whole lot of followers at that point, but it's like, well, I'm already doing all the work of testing the lenses and gathering all the information. I might as well shoot a little video review just so I, kind of maximize the work that I'm already putting in. Well, it turns out that over time that the YouTube channel is now even more popular than what my website is in terms of overall views. Though fortunately, I do have a lot of people that still like text reviews and still come to my website. So, yeah, that was kind of a fluky thing that just kind of developed over time. Yanni asked, Dustin, if you could throw a wish list for our designer to craft a new macro lens, what specs do you want? Tell you this. How about this? One thing I haven't seen Laowa tackle that I'm aware of is a longer focal length. And so I think that there is a lot of room for that. The reason why I say that is that a lot of the existing, say like Canon has a 180 millimeter, I think it's an f3.5 L series lens. That lens is like over 20 years old. And so, but I still get a lot of feedback from people that say, do you know of something like that that's coming for Sony or coming for Canon RF? Or is Canon going to update that? And so I know that there certainly is interest in some of the longer focal lengths for macro photography. And so I would say that could be an interesting project because Laowa has really done some really creative things on the wide angle, and then at more standard, distances like 60 millimeters and 100 millimeters, which are obviously very popular focal lengths for that. But I would like to see them maybe try something with a longer focal length, particularly since you have the capacity to build an apochromatic lens. If you could create a lens with a longer working distance, which is particularly nice for people that do insect photography. And I know that the probe macro lens it's probably the most unique lens pretty much out on the market right now. It's also a really, really niche lens. And so I think that there certainly is a market for a longer focal length for that. So Jerry asks, which lens that you have tested gives you the best impression and makes you eager to own it for life? Well, I will say this. I mean, I've been able to test some really amazing lenses. And so probably the lens that first just like knocked me right off my feet was when I had a chance fairly early on when I was doing reviews to review the Zeiss Otis 85mm f1.4. And while it's big, incredibly expensive, and manual focus, it was fabulous. And so I saw images there that I've never been able to get before. And so a lens like that is really, really fantastic. Most recently, kind of highest on my wish list at the moment, and so maybe I can better answer that, is that I recently tested the Sony 135mm f1.8 G Master lens. That's definitely a lens that's way up on my personal wish list right now. It's optically incredible and very, very useful for portrait photography. And so I will say that. I'll also point out, as far as the lens that I have kept the longest in my kit, is actually a macro lens, and that is the Canon 100mm f2.8 LIS macro. And I've had it for, I think, 10 years. And so there's been a lot of lenses that have come and gone from my kit. And I keep hanging on to that one. So there you go. That's multiple answers to one question. Patrick asks, there is a rule of thumb to use 1 to the ratio is not completed, to the focal length for the shutter speed when shooting handheld. I assume it has to be fast when using extension tubes. Any rule for that? So here's the thing about macro or extension tubes, and that is the law of physics comes into play. What I mean by that is that the effective aperture, not the size of the aperture. Like you set, say, an f2.8, this lens right here, if I set it at f2.8, the physical aperture is f2.8 no matter what. But the nature of physics means that when I get down to close focus distances, it means that you require more light to get equivalent lighting to f2.8. So while the aperture is still f2.8, it's probably going to behave more like f5.6 or even smaller. And so, yeah, you have to be aware of that when shooting macro. The other thing you have to be really aware of and keeping your shutter speed up for handheld macro, which, by the way, it's really, really helpful, incredibly helpful to have some kind of image stabilization to help with that if you're shooting handheld. But the other factor to consider is that motion blur, which comes from camera shake, because you're shooting so close, and it means that every bit of blur occupies more pixels, which means it's more obvious. So yes, you have to be really careful about your shutter speed and make sure that you keep it up for that. Kevin says that our designer, Daeyong Lee, is here. That's cool, and so hopefully there's some feedback from you. A question being ported over from YouTube. It's hard to focus for a translucent subject, a water or a bubble. Any suggestion? Very, very good point. So my recommendation is to put a physical object down into the area where you want to focus on, that you're going to make as a target. I've sometimes even made a target on the bottom of whatever I'm dropping the liquid into, and then sticking up something for a moment. That way you can focus on the physical object, remove the physical object, and then still shoot for the target that you've made on the bottom of the dish or the bowl or whatever you're shooting on. So yeah, that can be a challenge, but if you set it up in advance And then if you have an autofocus lens, be sure to turn autofocus off after that point. Stay in manual focus. If you're using a manual focus lens, just don't hit the focus ring at that point. All right. Another ported over YouTube from Joan C. Is it better to use external flash or a ring flash, or does an LED panel work best? That is an answer that there is no, that's a question that there's no one answer to. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And so I often use fixed lights. It's so like, what you would consider an LED panel. And so that allows me to have a constant light source. It means that I'm not worrying about any kind of sinking. And so I also get a sense of the ambient light. And so I actually like fixed lighting for a lot of situations because I know exactly what I'm going to get when I click the shutter, because I can preview it. But ring lighting is often gives you more even illumination. And so if your goal is even illumination, a dedicated macro ring light, and Laowa does make some of those, it actually gives you illumination all around your subject. So it gives you a more even lighting, and it's often fairly gentle light. And so that can be really popular. Using an external speed light or a strobe is probably only recommended if you want a really dramatic kind of light, or if you want to stop motion by pumping a lot of light through it. And so unfortunately I can't give you one answer, because you have to choose the right tool for the right job, and that unfortunately is my complicated answer. Another question from YouTube. Space Kotzi says, I want to see a lens that focuses to infinity and 5x macro. Well, we do have engineers, I understand, tuning in right now, and so they might be able to give a response as to the engineering possibilities of that. But you're right, to this point, I'm not aware of a lens that does both of those things. And so what you might be able to do, if that's really a priority for you, is that right now you could take one of Laowa's 2x macro lenses. You could put extension tubes on it that could get you very close to 5x macro. Although you would be very, very close to your subject, very close to your subject, but and then retain infinity. I'm not a designer, so I don't know that I can tell you how that is physically possible. Another one from YouTube, Keeman Jones: how to keep the background, it would go so dark when using a flash. So that's all about lighting ratios, and so the short answer to that is that you have two ways of controlling that. You can either increase the ambient light on your background. If you're outdoors, that's not really a possibility. So your answer to that then is you need to reduce the amount of light coming off of the flash. And so you can do that a number of ways. You can manually control your light output and bring the light down. And so the lighting ratio, it's not so bright right on your subject and then dim elsewhere. And so that's one way to do that. And basically, you have to, if you're out in the field, that's probably the only light that you can really control all that much. If you're indoors, you can just increase the light on the background if that's a priority to you. Okay, another one from Patrick. Do you know if the Laowa 100mm with the RF mount has the motor for aperture control, or is it manual? And so Yanni has actually helped to answer that, and she says that the RF mount is fully manual. It doesn't have auto aperture, unfortunately. And so that is a good question. Maybe Yanni, I'll also put out, someone else had another question, and that is a question as to whether or not if you're using the EF version of the 100mm that does have an electromagnetic aperture, they wanted to know if you are using it with the Canon EF to RF control ring adapter on a Canon EOS or EOS R body, if you can control the aperture through the control ring. And so I don't know the answer to that, because when I tested the 100mm, I didn't have an EOS R body at that point. So maybe if you can chime in the comments and respond to that, that would help out someone who asked me that question actually earlier on YouTube before I went into this live stream. So I think we're coming towards the tail end of the various questions, and I'm way over time at this point. That tends to happen because I can't give a simple answer to anything. but that's kind of the nature of the beast for doing so much different photography and gear. And so anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed this live stream. I've certainly enjoyed hanging out with you and sharing, answering some questions, and hopefully some of the projects that you saw will stir up the creative juices and get you engaged in doing some projects at home yourself. And so once again, I want to thank you for coming on board for the live stream today. Do want to remind you again, if you want to get that discount at Laowa, you can use the code 253MDA, and at Venus, at their Venus store, they will give you 5% off. And so once again, thanks to for Laowa for the invitation to share with you today. I hope that this has been as fun for you as it's been for me. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you have a great day.